All right, so let's continue on here by looking at these 6 ways that this article in the School of Life, encourages us to consider the way that comedy very well might be therapeutic, right? And what can we kind of, again, dive deeper into about the nature of comedy and its use, its purpose, its focus. So there's 6 key ways, and the first here is comedy as therapy for despair. Okay, and this touches on existential themes that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Where, it's kind of a brute fact of life that we're going to die. Sorry. But how do we respond to it, right? Do we meet it with despair, or do we meet it with another outlook? Perhaps a comedic outlook. Right? And this is where one of those questions for existentialism is, how do we act in the face of the absurd? That much of our world, much of our reality, much of our existence, frankly, is fairly absurd. And so what do we do about it? Right? How do we respond to it? And do we take perhaps kind of a comedic lens towards some of those things that cause us the most despair? Right? And this is where, in the article, it suggests, right, many of our gravest problems don't have solutions. We suffer, then we die, right? Work is painful, but we can't escape it. There's no happily ever after in love, oftentimes, right? But a comedic attitude doesn't deny misery, but it has a very different relationship with it, right? And so this idea of black humor as maybe one of those subgenres that was listed in that Wikipedia list from Tuesday, which again I highly encourage you to go look at. Right, this article suggests that it's infused with kind of a mood of defiance, right? That reality is the way that it is, and it's unpleasant, it's messy, it's full of despair. But I'm going to have a defiant look at it and try to live kind of more in that archetype of an existential hero, right? Things kind of suck, but well, shit, might as well make the best of it, right? And kind of taking on kind of that look at it. Right, and continuing on, again, this idea of thinking about black humor in particular for this article, where it makes the connection here. Black humor works on the assumption that we tend to despair too soon. That is, the situation feels more hopeless than it really is. Okay, so it's genuinely bad, but we experience it as truly catastrophic by mocking dangerous things sometimes. Right? By mocking dangerous things sometimes, humor emboldens us. Okay? Again, kind of a wild way of thinking about that. That if we make fun of a situation, we kind of disarm it in a way. Right? So again, similarly, going back to Tuesday's video discussions, when I was talking about the idea of humoring, somebody asking me to humor them by eating a Brussels sprout, right? Well, perhaps they make a joke about Brussels sprouts before I take a bite to kind of disarm me, right? To let my kind of guard down. Or perhaps I make a joke about Brussels sprouts, right? These little green vegetables that kind of look like little brains of squirrels or something. I don't know, right? But that kind of disarms me to maybe feel more comfortable eating a Brussels sprout, right? So there is an interesting way that this kind of way humor, again, perhaps can embolden us. Okay? The next key here, number 2, comedy as therapy for humiliation. And so again, kind of weird to think about, but life is filled with things that threaten our dignity. We're never far from being reduced to complete mockery. Okay? And their example in this article is Peppa the Pig and Daddy Pig and Peppa the Pig, which I think is a British thing, which I don't really want to go into. I'm going to allow that. Sorry. It'll pop up on my screen. So Peppa the Pig, I'm not really going to go into that. Yada, yada, yada. But essentially, sorry, going a lot of different ways. But this idea, when we think about mockery, right, when we think about kind of what mockery does, is we just think about the nature of comedy is therapy for humiliation, right? And these things that like threaten our dignity. Well, how do we respond to that? Again, this idea that like, do we humiliate ourselves? How far do we let others humiliate us? Do we humiliate others to kind of make ourselves feel better, which feels a bit twisted, but we do sometimes do that, right? Or maybe kind of thinking about it in the way that they are referencing Peppa the Pig, is they depict this caricature, right, which makes us feel better, perhaps about ourselves, right? And so we can think of scenarios, we can think of characters that exhibit behavior that we would otherwise find repulsive, right? But that makes us feel better, okay? And we see this again, time and time again in TV shows, in films, in movies, where someone is just, again, so just kind of like out there that it makes us feel like we're doing all right, okay? And we don't kind of like fit this mold, we don't fit this caricature, we don't fit this representation of whatever it is that's being represented, okay? All right. Number 3, comedy as therapy for self-disgust. It can be pretty hard to live with ourselves. We're so painfully aware of the gap between our ideals of how we'd like to be and the reality of how we actually are. So often we're left feeling lonely with our flaws, failings, and rather sordid ways. Confessional comedy works by someone standing on a stage and admitting in public that they have had all kinds of faults which we normally feel embarrassed about and ashamed about. They interrupt our loneliness by admitting that they too get shy in public WCs, water closets, bathrooms, right? And don't know whether to shake hands with or hug acquaintances. We laugh with relief as the pent-up anxiety is safely discharged. So this is, again, kind of thinking about maybe more of the representational stand-up comics, right? They're up there and they're doing a bit about some sort of, whatever it is, right? Of some sort of commentary on society, on society, yeah. They're doing some sort of commentary, some comedic commentary on society, or these, again, norms that we've so nicely fit into a box, which in fact could use ridicule, that we all maybe get a little uncomfy about, right? And again, this idea of like thinking about what comics do by referencing this is they dismantle the secret fear of our own freakishness by making things feel more kind of like collected, okay? And again, you can think about this in so many different ways, whatever it might be. I mean, the example here is like the idea that you walk into a public bathroom, right, and it's a bit uncomfy, right? Like we've all had this situation, whether you're male or female, whether, whatever the case may be, right? We've all had this situation that public bathrooms are weird, right? Like nobody ever kind of like wakes up and says, you know what, I'm excited to go out into a public bathroom today, right? Like that's just not something that we do. But rather, public bathrooms and office spaces and schools, wherever they may be, are a part of our life. We go into them to do our business, right? So why not make a joke about that, right? Why not bring light to the fact that public bathrooms are a bit uncomfy, right? And that's kind of, again, this idea of therapy for self-disgust, right? Like, it's uncomfy to go in there. It's uncomfy to do your things, right? But also, comedy allows us that avenue. It allows us that out to notice and to recognize that we all share in the same experiences often. Or maybe not exact same, but at least similar, right? And so we think about that. 4, comedy as benevolent stereotyping, okay? And in the article, they bring up Woody Allen, which I think is funny as, as an academic, as one as an academic that Woody Allen so carefully kind of caricatures here, right? But this idea of like comedy as benevolent stereotyping, and again, you see this in all sorts of genres and all sorts of kind of depictions. And I like the idea of benevolent, right? Where you're giving them the kind of like benefit of the doubt, or you're being like playful with how you're stereotyping someone, right? Because we often think that stereotypes are dangerous, they're misleading, or they're limiting, however it is you kind of consider stereotypings. stereotypes, right? But this idea of like benevolent stereotyping is again kind of this like you go even further than the normal like caricature, and you can either do that in maybe like a really kind of like witty or like focused way, or a very like explicit way, right? So I'm thinking here, imagine a scene in a comedy or something like that, and let's say it's like a high school football movie, okay? And the kind of like typical vibe, the typical stereotypes around high school football players, and especially like jacked up, testosterone filled football players, right? Like the idea that you take that kind of to the extreme, especially if this is like a comedy, and you have kind of this again over the top character rather, right? That's really muscular, has a really deep voice, and really says, "Well, I love football, and that's all that I love," right? Like, and just really playing like on these tropes. I mean, that's going to be kind of funny, right? And that's this kind of like benevolent stereotyping where it goes again, kind of like a bit too far, okay? And so, and they make reference here, right, of this idea of like the problem with stereotype is not so much that that they generalize, but that they so often generalize unfairly and unkindly. Okay, and so when we think about again benevolent stereotyping, we go further to again kind of like give a benefit of the doubt. And here in the article, it actually references it references the British office, and I'll just. Maybe this will tell you about my humor. It'll tell you about my proclivities when it comes to what I find humorous. The Office, the American Office, with Steve Carell and cast. That's probably my favorite show. I really like The Office, and subsequently I really like Parks and Rec. But here they make reference of David Brent, which is the Michael Scott of the British Office. And it makes reference here that, I mean, David Brent is like just likable enough, similar with Michael Scott, that Michael Scott is just like, he's repulsive, he's fairly idiotic at times, he seems to miss so much, right? But he has these little moments of redemption that you're like, he might be there, right? He might be just as, it might be plausible, okay? And so we see this in comedy all the time where it goes just a little too far, but there's enough there to be like, redemptive. Okay? Number 5, comedy as therapy for power and powerlessness. Here, right? And I mean, you can think about this in a lot of different ways, but it's hugely reassuring here to see the powerful laughing at themselves, right? Whether that's in politics, whether that's in celebrity, whether that's your teachers even, right? But this idea that like it's hugely reassuring to see the powerful laughing at themselves, finding oneself comical as a token of maturity, right? And there are times when I'm in the classroom and I say something that I'm like, I did not mean to say that, or I say something that doesn't even connect, or in some way I try to make a joke of like kind of my own misstep, if that's the right way of describing it. And in a way, like that self-awareness is something that definitely I want to be aware about, right? But the idea of being able to kind of like make fun of yourself, of being able to recognize that we're not perfect, recognize that we're not going to go through life succeeding in everything that we do, however small or however big that may be, right? But there's something very different about kind of the structure of power, right? That I think we like impose this image on the figures that are powerful in the world as like, perfect, that obviously they've worked really hard to get where they're at, that they're very, focused, that they're very, successful. But honestly, it's really good to see them laugh either at jokes or laugh at themselves or laugh with others, right? The thing that intimidates, finding oneself comical is a token of maturity. It means being able to see one's faults without being too defensive about them. The thing that intimidates us isn't actually power. It's power that looks like it's going to be inhumane, insensitive, and unkind power. Okay? Humor often provides a mechanism whereby the powerless can give constructive but pointed feedback to the powerful. Okay? And so this is, again, kind of a nice reference here of, and in the article you can see this picture of David Letterman and Barack Obama, right? Where, you know, this idea that Letterman was probably giving Obama a little bit of grief, right? And Obama kind of recognizes that and you know, becomes a little disarmed, chuckles, responds, right? And in a way that allows us to maybe have more empathy, more sympathy with them, okay? 6, comedy is therapy for losing perspective. We lose perspective all the time. A problem that is moderate, manageable size can easily look much bigger than it really is. We get into huge panic, or feel endangered and react in ways that make the situation worse. Without meaning to, we exaggerate. The comic technique, however, of dealing with exaggeration is to exaggerate so much that our own inflated ideas become small by comparison, right? It's natural, for example, to worry that one's conduct is inappropriate. Everyone else knows what you're supposed to do and does it easily, while you don't know the right thing, yada, yada, yada. While you might clap at kind of the wrong moment in a concert hall, laughter in a speech at something that was not meant to be laughed at, right? Well, that's kind of all part of it, right? That's, again, all part of it, as this idea of, like, it kind of disarms you. It allows you to, again, kind of, like, be in this place of it allows you to be in this place of either confusion, or it allows you to be in this place of, like, mild introspection where you kind of, again, lose perspective, okay? And so in thinking about this, right, the end of the article says that the comic perspective fills a central need of every society. It enables us to cope much better with our own follies and disappointments, our troubles around work and love, our difficulties enduring ourselves. Comedy is waiting to be reframed as a central tool behind the creation of a better world. Okay? And then you can see, if you've been following along, there is a link there that is done by the School of Life saying why comedy matters. Okay? All right, so this was a long video, but I hope you've made it this far, and I hope that those kind of like 6 points, again, kind of allow you to have a new perspective as it relates to comedy, as it relates to appreciating comedy, right? And kind of moving forward with that. There's going to be, I think, one more video where I kind of wrap things up and introduce a couple of other, yeah, I think there's going to be one more video. Cheers. Thanks for making it this far. Ooh.